Our mission is to foster a sense of worth, self, and health for those impacted by trauma while looking for inspiration to build a whole and fulfilling life. Hi everyone, this is Bebop aka Runic Rigel from the Runic Rigel Lifestyle channel. I am here today to talk to you about how to find a therapist. We are going to talk about how to find a therapist without it being too cost restrictive, without being insured. We're going to talk about how to get the most out of your therapy to some degree, although that's going to be a different video where we go a little more in depth for that, or a different episode if you're listening. And we're going to talk about why sometimes, you may have tried therapy and given up on it right away and just felt like it didn't work for you. We're going to talk about how to prevent that. And as somebody who's gone to 3 different therapists over my lifetime and been in therapy for 4 different therapists and had some experiences that didn't work out, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about how you can prevent that from being experienced for you. So a little background about me, as you most of you probably know, I'm a child abuse survivor. Experienced 15 years of chronic child abuse in my developmental years. So I have chronic PTSD due to experiencing trauma on a daily basis, multiple times a day for a long portion of my life, especially during my developmental years. And so I have a very big passion for helping others learn to understand their trauma and come to terms with it and how to treat it far sooner than I learned to do in my life. My 20s were a mess because I really didn't know what was happening or what to do. And part of what has helped me over the years is having some access to some excellent therapists. And that's from living in a small town to living in a larger city. I found some good ones along the way, but I've also had some very bad experiences. And to start, I want to talk to you a little bit today about some of the bad experiences that I've had. And let's get those out of the way, and then we'll talk about some of the good ones, and we'll talk about how we make sure that you don't have a bad experience. And if you have had a bad experience, I want to start by validating that right away, because it does happen, and it's very unfortunate, and sometimes it really does put people off of therapy for many years or permanently. I, as I stated, was a victim of child abuse for many years. I was removed from my home at age 15 and eventually, after some other traumatic incidences, housed with my grandparents, who did their best. I had access to school counselors and religious counselors, and in particular, the religious counselors that I had really aggravated my trauma, further traumatized me. I would ask for help, and I would just be told, like, have you told Jesus that you love him today? And this is not me mocking anyone's religion. This is me telling you my personal experience as somebody who grew up in Texas as a Southern Baptist. I really didn't have a good experience when I went to school counselors. I was told I was selfish. And this is something I bring up because I want you to understand that anyone can call themselves a counselor, really. And not everybody has the credentials, and that's the first thing I want you to know. Really, the first thing I want you to know is that therapists are human beings. They are not perfect. They are human beings. They are a psychologist with a doctorate is a highly trained individual. However, school counselors, clergy, sometimes like people like that don't really have the doctoral credentials are, I could walk into a church or an institution and say, I'm a counselor, I'm a mediator, and I could have done zero research and just fancied myself an intellectual that can give advice on the human condition. That doesn't make me qualified to do so, but I could say that about myself. So I want you to understand that it's like dating, you don't know what you're going to get, and so the best way we can prevent something like that from happening is researching. And I would highly recommend this, especially if you're looking for counseling for a minor individual, because while an adult may have the wherewithal to understand this isn't really working out, this is making me uncomfortable, it may not be that way for a minor. They may not have the life experience to contextualize when something's just not right, and they may end up receiving some really further traumatizing and damaging advice or leadership from somebody who isn't qualified on their condition to give it to them or to even diagnose them. So if you haven't guessed, a big part of this is understanding credentials. And I was actually really surprised because I've received mixed reviews or opinions on the application called BetterHelp, where you can find a therapist. And I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that they had an article out differentiating between different therapists and counselors, because I think that's something that people don't know. Getting counseling doesn't mean that you're necessarily meeting with a licensed counselor or a therapist with a doctorate. And so they did break it down between a clinical psychologist, who is somebody who has like a PhD, that deals with more severe mental health issues like severe anxiety, depression, bipolar disorders, and eating disorders. So I have chronic PTSD, as I think I've mentioned it in prior episodes for sure. And so when I have looked for a therapist, I've come to understand that I need to find somebody who is a licensed psychologist, who has a deep understanding of dealing with a mental health disorder. Because for me, I'm not just looking for a little guidance or mediation. I know for myself, I have a severe mental disorder that has impacted my entire life and continues to do so well into my 30s. There are licensed clinical social workers that can provide therapeutic counseling. They do have some training typically as like a resource and referral for services for children and adolescents and sometimes adults, but these are not people that are trained necessarily for psychological disorders. There's marriage family therapists, which can support individuals and couples with mental health issues and relationship issues. I think these are kind of a little more common at like churches and things like that. And then there's licensed professional counselors, which provide therapeutic counseling services for individuals and couples struggling with relationship issues and life changes. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot of information here. They all, if you're not paying attention, they all sound a little similar, don't they? They're all just people that can help people. But if you suspect that you actually have a mental disorder that's significantly impacting your life, I would recommend looking for a clinical psychologist. And sorry, that brings me to my next point, which is there is a difference between a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is generally able to assist with psychiatry, which is medication. A psychologist generally isn't able to give out medication. They are a clinical psychologist meant to deal in psychological, cognitive, behavioral therapy. So there's many kinds of therapy. There's behavioral therapy, CBT, humanistic, psychodynamic. There are sexual therapy. There's many different kinds of therapy, and there's many different kinds of approaches. If you feel like you need cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's something that you need to talk to your therapist about and discuss. My therapist does not necessarily do cognitive behavioral therapy, and sometimes that's really not effective for people with PTSD, which you may be surprised to hear. I wish I could remember the kind of therapy that she does, but unfortunately off the top of my head, I cannot remember it. But the point being is that everybody has different qualifications, and everybody has different price points, and everybody has different techniques and approaches that they use. And as for me, I'm not a religious individual. I would not want a religious counselor. I would not want to involve God or prayer. I would want to really have a science behind coming to understand myself. I do have a sense of spirituality, but for me, that's a deeply personal process. And it's something that I've learned to, my spirituality is something I've learned to embrace, or you could call it my emotionality, my embracing my idea that I am like an emotional being, and I want to connect emotionally and to some kind of sense of being. That's maybe something for a different time to discuss, but I don't necessarily want a therapist or a counselor that's going to approach it sheerly from that angle. And so it is important that you understand that some people, they do really have that, and maybe that's something that you do want. But if that's something you don't, then you might want to consider consider that when you are looking for a therapist, and see if they do any kind of religious-based therapy. Even if they don't engage with religiously with you, it may be something that might kind of flavor their style. So understand again that these are people, these are human beings, and they all have different qualifications, they all have different backgrounds, they all have different styles, and there are different kinds of therapy. And some you may think absolutely will not work for me, some you may think will. For me, I was very surprised when my therapist didn't do cognitive behavioral therapy and instead had a different approach, but I can say her approach has worked. I want to say it's called family systems, and it has worked so well for me so far. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when looking for a therapist. And, it's like dating. You may meet somebody and it's just not working. When I went into grief counseling after my father died, I had a therapist and I think I saw her 3 times. It did not feel right to me. I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. I kind of felt like almost like I was failing her by not talking to her about what she wanted me to talk about when I was in the sessions. She could be a great therapist for somebody else. She was not a great therapy for me. And unfortunately, that put me off therapy for another year. I kind of felt like it was just like hopeless to do grief counseling, and it was expensive. And we're going to talk about the cost of that as well soon. But again, consider the source. And if I know a lot of people say, oh, if you're going through a hard time, turn to your clergy. I want to strongly recommend that you do that with caution, because a lot of time clergy is part of somebody's community. It's where they go to maybe have a sense of escape and well-being. And if that is where you feel safe to discuss, I'm not going to discourage you from going there, because I'd rather you discuss with somebody you trust than no one. But also I do want you to just, approach that with caution and realize that although clergy have typically had some kind of training, I have known a lot of clergy members over my time that did not have my well-being in mind. They just had more of a focus of religion. I know personally a pair of ministers who are absolutely toxic and destructive individuals. They do not have any kind of doctorate or training in, behavioral health, and their own personal relationships are a mess, and they go preach to their congregation every Sunday. So I'm not going to sugarcoat the fact that I'm definitely an advocate of pursuing somebody with a doctorate and a medical license if that is something you can find. And if you really do think you have a mental health behavioral issue. And I think that counselors and mediators and social workers have their place. I have a friend that's a social worker who acted as a mediator, and they're a wonderful individual, and I think that absolutely has their place. But it's up to you to understand whether or not you think you need somebody who has a real understanding of a psychological disorder, or just somebody who's going to kind of counsel, suggest, mediate, and listen. And just understand that you are, when you are doing this, you're in a vulnerable spot. You're really opening yourself up, and even you want to be able to have that, tap in and access that vulnerability without wondering if some little thing that somebody says is going to kind of tap into you and like lead you astray, so to speak. So just kind of, approach with caution and awareness, and research and education when you're doing that. The other piece of advice I have is, a lot of time people seek out therapy because they want to get couples counseling. And one thing that was recommended to me when I wanted to do couples counseling in my prior relationship was to make sure that I got individual therapy first. And that was such a wonderful idea, because no amount of couples counseling is going to help me address and treat my post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that a lot of couples can benefit from doing individual therapy and then coming together to learn how to not only understand themselves first individually, but then how to interact with each other. Just keep that in mind, that your happiness comes from within. You're responsible for your own happiness. You're responsible for your own growth. And so I'm so grateful that I did that and was able to make sure that, when I did approach couples counseling, that it wasn't from a codependent mindset. It wasn't from, if I fix the relationship, I'll fix my life. I got to a place where I understood that I was really accountable for my own happiness and health. So that's, do what's right for you. It's something to consider. And I also want to encourage you, if your spouse or significant other will not, which mine would not, at certain times, to do that work on yourself. And I think it's really a wonderful thing to get to a point where you can feel comfortable, with yourself. It's very, very empowering. So don't be discouraged about getting therapy. If what you really want is couples counseling, don't be discouraged to get individual therapy. And the final thing we're going to talk about is something that's really important, and that is considering the cost. There's a few different ways to go about this. I am not sponsored. And one thing I absolutely want to recommend to you, I got recommended this randomly on like some meme. And this is how I found my therapist and was able to get therapy without spending hundreds of dollars per session. I use this place called Open Path Collective. And what that is it's therapy on a sliding scale, I think, for people that are uninsured. And I think a lot of therapists are doing this now. They're cutting out the middleman of insurance, which I think is great. And Open Path Collective will actually allow you to find a therapist in your area. I believe it's nationwide. And you pay $50, and then it will allow you to contact the therapist and request that they potentially treat you, have a discussion with them about the therapy that you need. And I found my wonderful therapist that way. She has a doctorate and she has been amazing. I've made so much progress in the half or so year that I've been seeing her, and she charges me, I don't want to get specific, but it's well under $50 a session, which allows me to have access to therapy that I normally otherwise would not be able to afford. It's been completely life-changing for me. I'll put a link to that in the description, Open Path Collective. The other one that's very popular right now is BetterHelp, where you can find a therapist that is maybe more affordable for you. And that's part of why I wanted to do this, because if you are looking at these online resources, I am going to link that BetterHelp article, which was surprisingly helpful. But I want to emphasize a little more than that article did, that it's very important to find somebody with the proper qualifications. And remember that different therapists have different qualifications. They treat different disorders as well. Somebody might have experience in helping with addictions. Somebody might have help with eating disorders. Somebody might be able to help with post-traumatic stress disorder. So, keep in mind and do your research. And if it doesn't work out with them, don't be afraid to change therapists. There are also therapy groups that you can join for a low cost or for free. It's not therapy, but look for therapy groups in your area where you can maybe at least have somebody to get things off your chest or feel less isolated. Having a sense of support and community is very important for recovering from trauma, as we discussed in our last video on accepting trauma. And there is, of course, always religious institutions. And as I said, I highly recommend approaching with caution, but you may also be able to reach out to your religious institution and say, hey, I need help covering my therapy costs. Can you help me with that? And some churches may do that even if they can't provide counseling, or if you don't feel their counselor is qualified, if you have a strong relationship with your religious institution. So those are my tips for finding more affordable ways to receive therapy. I will leave links to those resources down below. Highly recommend Open Path Collective. It was an absolute life changer for me. I don't think they do much publicity. I don't know how they stay funded other than the $50. Technically, if I wanted to, I could have found my therapist, ignored, not gone through them, and gone with therapy anyway. Technically, the therapists on the Open Path Collective do need to see that you've joined the Open Path Collective before working with you. It could easily be bypassed, but $50 is not too bad of an entry spot to be able to then get therapy for a more affordable cost. And if it keeps that organization going, I was happy to pay it, because it's been such a life-changing thing for them to connect me with a therapist that's helped me so much at a cost that's so much more affordable for me. So I wish that for you, and I hope that for you. And I will continue to be here as a resource to try to help navigate you in this complicated modern world of technology and trying to deal with trauma and make human connections in this like crazy pandemic world, and a world that was already kind of crazy enough before that. So that's it for this episode, everyone. Thank you so much for watching or listening. I hope I'll see you again here.